All right, so let's dive into this paper about TableGPT. Um, you know how we're always, like wrestling with spreadsheets and trying to make sense of data.
Yeah.
Well, this is about researchers who are trying to teach AI to do the same thing, understand tables and work with them just like we do.
It's pretty remarkable, actually, when you think about how much time we spend dealing with tables in our everyday lives, like
Yeah.
financial stuff, uh, planning a budget, even just glancing at a menu.
Right.
They're everywhere.
Yeah, exactly. In this paper, uh, TableGPT, towards unifying tables, natural language, and commands into one GPT, makes a great point in the introduction. Data scientists, they actually spend a huge chunk of their time just getting data into a usable format.
It's a major bottleneck in the process.
Yeah.
And that's where TableGPT comes in. It's being explored as a potential solution.
So what exactly is TableGPT?
Well, at its core, it's a system designed to understand both natural language, like how we talk and write, and the language of tables, with all their rows, columns, and data.
So theoretically, you could ask it a question in plain English, and it could actually find the answer in a table.
That's the idea. And one of the interesting things is that the researchers chose a model called Phoenix as their base,
Okay.
specifically because it's good at working with both English and Chinese, as they note in section 2.1, model design.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So they're thinking about making this accessible across languages.
Right.
That makes sense.
It broadens the potential uses quite a bit.
But here's what I find really challenging to grasp. How do you get an AI to understand a table as a focal TL?
Yeah.
Not just individual pieces of data.
Right.
That feels like a huge conceptual leap.
It's a big challenge. Representing something as abstract as a table is very different from working with images or audio, which have, more inherent structure.
Yeah.
It's difficult to get an AI to see the big picture, so to speak.
So how does TableGPT handle this global table representation issue, as they call it, in section 2.2?
Well, they've developed something called a cascaded table encoder. It essentially creates a kind of summary of the entire table, giving the AI a high-level view of the data.
So it's not just looking at individual cells, it's actually seeing the relationships between them across the entire table.
Exactly. And that's what allows TableGPT to move beyond simple calculations and get into more sophisticated types of analysis.
Now, this is where it gets really interesting for me. The idea of a chain of command, as described in section 2.3, it's almost like giving the AI a set of instructions instead of just throwing a bunch of data at it.
Right. And this is a big part of what makes the system more accurate and reliable. It breaks complex tasks down into smaller, more manageable steps, rather than trying to do everything at once.
Which also makes it less prone to errors, I'd imagine. It's easier to troubleshoot a series of instructions than one massive calculation.
Precisely.
So how does this chain of command actually work in practice? Can you give me an example?
Yes. Sure. The paper uses a great example. Let's say you ask TableGPT, show me the 5 movies with the highest profit margin. Instead of trying to do all the calculations at once, it would break the task down into steps.
Okay, I'm following.
First, it would check to see if there's a profit margin column in the table. If not, it uses the information available, like box office revenue and production costs, to calculate that margin. Then it sorts the movies by profit margin. Finally, it selects the top 5.
So it's almost like a human would approach the problem, step by step.
Exactly. And this approach is what allows TableGPT to be more robust and better able to deal with even vague or incomplete instructions.
That chain of command concept is really clever. I can see how it makes a big difference.
It's a powerful idea, and it has a lot of potential for how we might interact with data in the future.
Now, one of the things that I always wonder about with these types of advancements is how they can be applied to different fields. Not everyone speaks the same technical language.
Right.
Can TableGPT handle that kind of variation?
That's where the domain data processing pipeline comes in, as they describe in section 2.4.
Okay.
It allows TableGPT to adapt to the specific terminology used in different industries.
So it's not just about understanding tables in a general sense, but about applying that knowledge to situations where the language can be highly specialized.
Exactly. And they're using some really interesting techniques to do this, like active learning and vector databases.
We may need to delve into those a bit more later, but for now I'm curious about the results they're seeing. Does this actually work? What kind of evidence do they have?
Well, they include a series of case studies, which you can find in figures 2 through 8 in the paper.
Okay.
These show TableGPT in action, answering questions, creating visualizations, and performing other tasks.
Okay, so they're not just making claims, they're actually showing what it can do.
Right, and one of the most interesting pieces of evidence is Table 1.
Okay.
It compares TableGPT to other systems like Chat Excel and Sheet Copilot.
Ah, so we can see how it stacks up against the competition.
Exactly.
What are some of the key takeaways from that comparison?
Well, one thing that stands out is that TableGPT seems to have an advantage because it's been specifically fine-tuned for tables, as they discuss in section 3.2, comparison with previous command using LLMs.
Okay.
It's designed from the ground up with tables in mind.
Interesting. So it's not just a general language model that's been adapted for tables, it's purpose-built.
Right. And that seems to be a significant advantage.
This is all very exciting, but I think it's important to take a moment to really absorb all this information before we go any further.
Yeah,
We've covered a lot of ground.
I agree. It's good to pause and reflect before we move on to the next part of our deep dive. So we've established that TableGPT can understand both the way we talk and the structure of tables. But I'm curious how it actually manages to do that. Earlier, you mentioned the global representation of a table.
Right, and you talked about the cascaded table encoder that makes that possible. That was back in section 2.2, global representation of table.
Exactly. It works in a way that's kind of like how a data scientist might approach a new table. It starts by looking at the metadata, things like column names, data types, and any descriptions that come with the table. That gives it a basic sense of what the table is about.
So it's getting a feel for the structure and the purpose of the table before it even starts looking at the actual numbers.
Precisely. And that's important because it helps TableGPT understand the context of the data. It's not just a random collection of numbers, it's information about something specific.
So it's learning what the data represents, not just what it is.
Right. And that's where the second part of the cascaded table encoder comes in. It actually analyzes the data values themselves, looking for things like distributions, trends, and relationships between the different columns.
So it's going beyond just recognizing the structure and starting to understand the patterns hidden within the data.
Exactly. And by combining its understanding of both the metadata and the data values, it's able to create that global representation we were talking about. It's like building a mental model of the entire table.
That's fascinating. So it's not just processing the data, it's actually building a kind of understanding of what it all means.
Right. And that understanding is what allows it to do more complex things like answer questions about the data or generate reports. It's not just crunching numbers, it's using its knowledge to offer insights.
This brings us back to that idea of the chain of command, which was discussed earlier. How does the global representation factor into that process?
Well, imagine you ask TableGPT something like, show me the average salary by department. Because it has this global understanding of the table, it knows which columns represent salary and department.
So it's not just matching keywords, it's actually understanding the concepts those words represent within the context of the data.
Right. And because it understands those concepts, it can then figure out the sequence of commands needed to get the answer. In this case, it might group the data by department first and then calculate the average salary for each group.
So the chain of command is like a set of instructions, guided by its understanding of the data that it uses to achieve a specific goal.
Precisely. And the important thing to remember is that this approach is much more reliable than just trying to have the AI calculate the answer directly.
It's like breaking a big, complicated problem down into smaller, more manageable steps.
Exactly. And this step-by-step process makes it easier to see what's going on and to figure out where any errors might be happening, which is essential when we're talking about systems that are using data to make decisions.
This is all starting to paint a picture of a future where working with data is much more intuitive and user-friendly.
Mm.
We could just ask questions in natural language and get meaningful answers back.
That's the ultimate goal, and TableGPT is a big step in that direction.
Now let's shift gears for a minute and talk about how this technology could be used in the real world.
Okay, let's explore some practical applications.
I'm particularly interested in the potential for TableGPT to make data analysis more accessible to everyone. Right now, you often need specialized skills and software to get any real insights from data.
That's a great point, and TableGPT could change that. Imagine being able to simply ask your data questions and get clear, concise answers regardless of your technical background.
That would be a huge shift. It would empower people to make more informed decisions in all sorts of areas.
Absolutely. Whether it's managing your personal finances, making strategic business decisions, or even conducting scientific research, the ability to easily analyze data could have a significant impact.
It's exciting to think about the possibilities. But you did mention earlier that TableGPT is still under development. What are some of the limitations or challenges they're still working on?
Well, like with any new technology, there are still some hurdles to overcome.
Like what?
One thing is that it's not quite a finished product yet. It's still being refined and improved.
So there might be some bugs or issues that need to be ironed out.
Right. There are also some technical challenges that need to be addressed. For example, right now, TableGPT works best with structured data that's neatly organized in tables with clear headers and data types.
So it might struggle with data that's more methy or disorganized.
That's a possibility. And then there's the issue of scalability. It's been tested on relatively small data sets so far, but it's not clear how well it would perform on massive data sets with millions or even billions of rows.
So they still need to figure out how to make it robust enough to handle the huge amounts of data that many organizations work with.
Exactly. But even with those limitations, the potential of TableGPT is clear. It's a technology that could fundamentally change how we interact with data.
It's a glimpse into a future where data analysis isn't just for experts, but something that anyone can use and benefit from.
And that's a really exciting prospect.
Before we move on, I'd like to circle back to something you mentioned earlier, active learning. Can you explain a bit more about how that's being used in TableGPT?
Sure. Active learning is a way to make machine learning models more efficient. It involves being selective about which data is used to train the model.
So instead of just feeding the model all the data at once, they're choosing the most important pieces.
Exactly. And that's especially useful when you have massive data sets where it's not practical to train the model on every single data point.
So how does this work with TableGPT?
One way they're using it is to have the model identify the data points that it's most uncertain about.
So the model is basically figuring out what it needs to learn more about.
Right. And then it can ask for those specific data points to be labeled or explained by humans.
So it's a kind of collaboration between the AI and human experts.
Exactly. And that collaboration helps to make sure the model is learning from the most relevant and informative data.
That's a really smart approach. It makes the training process much more focused and efficient.
It does. And it's one of the things that contributes to TableGPT's impressive performance.
This has been a really insightful conversation so far. I feel like I have a much better grasp of how TableGPT works and what it can do.
It's been great exploring these ideas with you.
Before we move on to the last part of our deep dive, I think it's worth taking a moment to look at Table 1, which you mentioned earlier. It compares TableGPT to some other systems that are out there.
Yes, Table 1 is a good summary of the competitive landscape, as described in Section 3.2, comparison with previous command-using LLMs.
What stood out to you from that comparison?
Well, one of the things that jumps out is the difference in evaluation metrics used.
Okay, what do you mean by that?
Different research teams sometimes use different ways to measure how well their systems perform. It's not always a straightforward apples-to-apples comparison.
So how do we make sense of those differences?
It requires careful consideration of what each metric is actually measuring and how it relates to the specific tasks the system is designed for.
That makes sense. It's not enough to just look at the numbers. You need to understand the context.
Right. And another thing to keep in mind is that this field is evolving rapidly. New systems and approaches are constantly emerging.
So what we're seeing with TableGPT is just a snapshot of where things are right now.
Exactly. It's an exciting glimpse into the future of data analysis.
I'm really eager to see what they come up with next.
Me too. This is a field with a lot of potential.
Okay, well, before we get ahead of ourselves, let's move on to the final part of our deep dive, where we'll take a closer look at the case studies that demonstrate TableGPT's abilities.
Sounds good to me.
All right, so we've talked about the theory behind TableGPT, but I'm really curious to see it in action.
Yeah, that's what the case studies are for.
Right.
They're in figures 2 through 8 in the paper, and they demonstrate how TableGPT handles a range of, real-world tasks.
So it's not just hypothetical. They've actually put this system through its paces.
Exactly.
Can you give us a taste of what they did? What kind of tasks were they able to accomplish with TableGPT?
Sure. In one case study, they gave TableGPT a table with financial data for a company. And it was able to answer some pretty complex questions about the company's performance, like identifying trends in revenue and expenses.
Interesting. So it's not just pulling data from the table. It's actually analyzing and interpreting it.
Right. And in another case study, they used TableGPT to create visualizations from a table of data. It generated charts and graphs that highlighted the key insights from the data.
That's really helpful. Visualizations can make a big difference in understanding and using data effectively.
Absolutely. And TableGPT can even go beyond static visualizations. It can create interactive dashboards that let users explore the data in more depth, as shown in Figure 7, Case Study, Interactive Data Exploration.
Wow, that's impressive. It sounds like TableGPT could be a really powerful tool for, anyone who works with data, not just experts.
I think so too.
We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. It's
Yeah.
been really fascinating to learn about TableGPT and its potential.
It has been an interesting discussion.
So as we wrap up, I'd like to leave our listeners with something to think about. If you could have a system like TableGPT at your fingertips, what would you use it for? What questions would you ask of your data? I think that's a great question to ponder as we continue to explore the exciting world of AI and data analysis.
I agree, the possibilities are endless.